Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Bonjour. Guten Morgen. Buongiorno. It's a pleasure to be with you all here today. There could be no topic, I think, more important. We are living in a moment in history where the intensity of the challenges that we face are outstripping the ability of our traditional approaches to solve them to keep up. They don't keep up. And that's why, of course, so many in the world speak about the power of digital technology. But we all know that digital technology by itself intrinsically does nothing. It's only when it connects to the lives of human beings and citizens. But that's not the only thing we've discovered. We've also discovered that if nation states advance digital transformation only by themselves, especially if they're not among the largest nations in the world, they cannot realize the full potential of the digital economy for their people. It requires partnership and collaboration. It requires cross-border connectivity. We have to build scale, create the diversity of opportunities and participants in the digital economy. This means countries have to collaborate in new ways. It means countries in the private sector have to collaborate in new ways. And our panel is here to discuss precisely those things in the context, of course, of the DCO, which is a new organization, a new institution in the world under an entirely new concept designed to do exactly that for its members. But before I go any further, allow me to introduce our esteemed panelist, Her Excellency, the Minister of ICT and Innovation. Paula, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us. And Francois, thank you very much, sir, for being with us. The first question, if I may, is to you, Your Excellency, is when momentum, once it's created, solves many problems. In driving digital transformation in a country like yours, where the progress has been amazing, before we get to how that progress is unfolding, what are the challenges of getting it started, of building momentum in the beginning?
Thank you, Rudolph, and good morning, everyone. Maybe let me start off even before I respond to your question. You did allude to everything that we're going to discuss here this morning is also going to be focused really on the power and benefits of being part of an organization like the Digital Cooperation Organization. And that power is in not just sharing of best practices, but to your point, you can't develop as an island. So if we're thinking about providing scale for what is happening in the various countries, because everyone is doing amazing things, but how do you provide scale? How do you provide a platform where best practices, knowledge sharing can happen? And I think that's something that the DCO team is doing very well. Now, in terms of getting started, I mean, it's always a hard job to even convince people as a starting point. Mindset is such a big thing in terms of if you're a country where all your resources are really spread across different things, how do you then convince everyone that digital is the way to go? You still have healthcare challenges to solve for. You still have food security challenges to solve for. You still have challenges around education, making sure you can provide quality and accessible education for all. How then do you make digital, also a priority among many other priorities? And I think the story for Rwanda is one where, if it hadn't been for the top leadership buy-in, for the visionary leadership of our president, who for him, he knew without digital, we can't go far, it was going to be difficult to even start that conversation. And so that for us was the key ingredient in really having someone who truly believed with strong conviction that the digital prosperity was the way to go for Rwanda as a country with limited natural resources, as a country that was coming out of a genocide that had wiped a lot of our people, a lot of our productive labor, but also as a country that is landlocked. And so you can only imagine the limitations that one would already have in place. And so mindset, that political will and buy-in and top leadership, visionary leadership is really what made it right for us, but which is also what I feel, to your point of challenge, is always the hardest part when you don't have that to get everyone started. So with all that in place, I think it made it easy now to really think about what are those investments that need to be made, putting out a 20-year roadmap, thinking about how do we mainstream this, how do we ensure that we're really walking the talk, and it's not just a beautiful strategy that we show the world, but really there's no impact that is happening on the ground.
100%. I thank you for that. And I was struck when you said landlocked. Then the issue of connectivity, building momentum and the requirement of leadership There's also an infrastructural dimension. And Francois, if I may, Francois is the chairman of Digiworld Institute. He's also the chairman and founder of FDB Partners. We're privileged to have him with. Honestly, I had the privilege of speaking with Francois several days ago in preparation, and I have rarely in my life, and I know a lot of people, met someone with such a depth of expertise in the areas we're talking about. So, Francois, when you consider then this challenge countries face getting started, where are the win-win partnerships between government and the private sector that can set the foundation for transformation? And in particular, of course, we're interested in cross-border partnerships, partnerships that enable cross-border collaboration.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. First of all, I was very impressed, Your Excellency, when I met your president twice about his vision, and also I was really impressed by the long-term vision. He was not driven by the election, he was driven by what's good for the country. That's why, by the way, now Rwanda is far ahead, despite all the challenge and the genocide and all the things you went through. So congratulations, and I know you've been part of the success. So, what is interesting in your question is everything starts by the infrastructure, because if you don't have access to the Wi-Fi, or if you don't have access to the fiber or whatever, then you have access to nothing. And the big challenge right now we have, not only in emerging countries or Africa, even in France, you have lots of white or what we call white or gray area, which is area where you have no signal. By the way, now you have holistic centers. You pay 10,000 euros a week to eat nothing and to have no access to the signal. It's called digital detox, by the way. What is very important when you have a big country like Rwanda is how it's easy to get fiber to the president's palais or to the banks. But if you drive 10 kilometers, then you have nothing. And the big challenge, if you want to educate the kids, or if you want to be very inclusive with rural people or women or old people, by the way, you need really to figure out how to bring the digital signal, wherever it comes from, satellite and whatever. And that's a real challenge, because who pays for that? The problem is, if you talk to operators, they will focus on the banks and where the big money is. If you talk to the World Bank, they want to have, inclusivity and rural things like that. But at the end of the day, you need to create a win-win deal where everybody benefits for everybody. Benefit, first of all, for the people. I've been lucky. I've been in this business for many years. I've started to program in 1977, by the way. I was in Silicon Valley at the right time, and I spent 10 years of my life to build digital infrastructure, internet and mobile, in Africa, of course, but I built the first the first internet services in Saudi, in China. So it's very interesting to look at this on a holistic basis and not only in the cities. So if you have a good approach, you need to have a holistic prism. So you have the citizens, you have what we call in France the big fingers. The big fingers are the people, it's a French word, by the way, les gros doigts, who have no access to digital. So you have the digital autist, the rebel, the old people, other people. And during the pandemic, we had 14% of the population called gros doigts who have access to digital. And it has changed dramatically their life. So the second thing is, when you're a telco operator, if you don't have a good regulation, driven by Your Excellency, I guess, there will be a temptation to go, in cities or resort where people are. So you need to have a good partnership between the governments and also the telco operators. And then you have all those OTTs, the Silicon Valley kids who make fortunes, and what they want is more infrastructure, because every time they add one clicker, we call that, their market cap grows. I just give you a number. If you add $1 billion of infrastructure in a country, you will get new clickers. So of course, if you go to New York, it's rich clickers. If you go to some rural part, it's cheap clickers. But cheap clickers can become a rich clickers. So it's an investment in the future. So 1 billion of investment of capex in infrastructure will generate for them $10 billion of market cap. So there is a big push from the OTT to have more infrastructure, not really to save the planet or to look good, you know, at the ESG on the picture where everybody is happy, but really because from a pure financial point of view, every time you add somebody, your market cap goes. So I think to be very concrete, you cannot be succeeding without having people around the table and to be very clear with the objectives. And I think maturity in a partnership is to respect the objective of everybody. Governments wants digital for everybody. The last 25 years, I've been talking about digital energy, like water, gas, electricity. And if I have one mission in life, is to bring connectivity everywhere in the world, you know, because I was lucky enough to build those infrastructure at the beginning. I trained 16,000, I financed the training of 16,000 young girls in South Africa. We created lots of programs in India, all over the world. And I can see in 3 months the transformation of the people. The other point is transborder. So I remember one day I went from Senegal to Ivory Coast. You know, there was no flight, so I was obliged to go to Morocco and come back. And sometimes, if you want to go from east to west, you go to Dubai and whatever. We have so some progress are being made, by the way. Is the same in digital space, because if you cannot have one country isolated, so you need to have a map of the countries. And how it works is very easy. I've built all the submarine cable that's around Africa. Then once you've done that, you put a fiber to the presidential palais and then all the banks. But if you don't have a strong policy coordinated with other country, it will never work. So the success, if we want to improve the digital infrastructure, which is the very basic of things to be done, you need to have all the stakeholders around the table, and you need to have discussion within all the countries. And I think that's a very important topic, like water, gas, electricity, because if you have a digital access, then your country will evolve very fast and will transform itself in a very professional manner.
Merci. Thank you, thank you so much, Francois. So let me recap what we've said so far. To build momentum, you need leadership to pervade the government, to create that starting place from which momentum can be built. And to enable connectivity, of course, requires infrastructure, but the private sector has a compelling, purely financial interest in connectivity as well. So there's an alignment of interest because, of course, connectivity is a prerequisite for participation. And then at the cross-border level, infrastructurally, in terms of agreement, having everyone at the same table, which, of course, is the aniya, the intent of the DCO, but Your Excellency, the Minister, where you have so much experience, given then the challenges of now that you have momentum, what are the challenges that you face that are most important where multilateral collaboration offers greatest leverage?
And maybe before I come to that, I wanted to pick up on what Francois mentioned. A couple of things. So we did talk about leadership, the role of the private sector, the role of regulations. But one thing, and I'll give a clear example, we have within East Africa, 8 years ago, we decided to have a one area network. What it was really going to help us with within the East African region was to reduce costs, whether it was data or calling between citizens in the region, because they're moving. It's a region where people have, the mobility is there, and so there were very high costs, roaming and all of that. And so with the one area network, it was meant to be sort of a proof of concept that perhaps once successful, every other region, west, south, and north, could take on, and eventually we can have the entire continent having something like this. And those are some of the successes where you have, even at a regional level, that kind of consensus, that kind of drive, where people feel like we can do this together. Today, we're talking about, what we call the single market. How is that going to be unlocked? Because you have to be thinking about things like cross-border data flows. What's the harmonization of regulations across the board on how you treat data, on how, and even financial services, all of these kind of things. But you can't do it if it's not a block that is together, it's not a block that has the same interests and objectives. But at the same time now, this is where organizations like DCO would cue in the right players, the private sector, the civil society, the development partners, who then also have a role to play in unlocking such opportunities. Now, back to your question around there are challenges before the momentum picks, but once it picks, then what? Because it's not always rosy anyway. And the challenges, and I'll probably also share from our experience, and maybe I'll not just dwell on Rwanda's experience, but also talk about the African context, because at least over the last 10 years, almost every government in Africa has put in a lot of investments in terms of digital infrastructure. And about 2 years ago, both GSMA and ITU caught very interesting statistics around broadband coverage. And what you see, because of the investments that governments have made, the investments that the operators that are playing in those markets are already making, is that, give or take, there's a good penetration of broadband coverage. But there's also an alarming statistic around usage. So even in countries, yesterday, and in the panel that we had again with the DCO, I think it was the president of Zimbabwe, who mentioned they have 80% population coverage. In Rwanda, we have 95% population coverage for 3G and 97% for 4G. But when you flip that and look at how many of those people that are living in areas of coverage are able to use and benefit from it, then it's a different reality. So for us, you have about 29% that are actually using and benefiting from this digital infrastructure that we've put in place. So what we quickly see and realize as policymakers, as partners, is that digital infrastructure in itself is not a means on its own. It's not the only thing that you'll do to unlock digital prosperity. And in hindsight, if we had the kind of knowledge that we have 10, 15 years later, once we've invested in this, I think we would have structured our investments differently. We would have structured our investments in such a way that you have a good balance between, yes, I'm rolling out this digital infrastructure, but what are the other levers that are going to encourage usage? How much of digital content, digitization of services is happening, because that's the value proposition for a citizen to actually use and benefit from that. That is how they'll see the benefit of the tower that is right next door, because they know, because of that piece of infrastructure, they're now able to access a healthcare service, a government service. But also, when it comes to emerging and developing economies, there's also the stark reality that, yes, on one hand, literacy skills are very low. So when you talk about digital literacy, they're even lower. So how then is there the right investments being made to make sure that you are skilling the population so that they can benefit from the digital investments that any country is making? And the fourth leg is really around affordability of devices, affordability of services. ITU has a threshold where it's, I think, 2% of a household income that can go to connectivity services. Many countries are far from even achieving that 2%. If you wanted to get the cost of 2% of a household's income, how much data do you get? It's not meaningful connectivity. And so it's the affordability of the services, it's the affordability of the devices. Just the other day, we were talking with some companies that were talking about $100 smartphones. That is still very expensive for many households. And so beyond bringing down the cost of devices, it's also figuring out how do you weave in financing schemes that are bundled services. So as a citizen who you're trying to show the value, you should be able to say, you get a smartphone, you get access to government services, you have X amount of data, Y calling minutes, Z SMS. And for them, what they're looking at is the service, and you can bake in the cost of the device, but then they can pay it over time. And so these are some of the creative models that, again, while it's easy to say, it's easier said than done, even government in itself cannot do it alone. And this is where we need partners who are then able to mobilize the community, the stakeholders that have both the technical capability, that have both the financial resources to be able to help us close on the gap that we're looking at.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Francois, to you, building exactly on this point. So from a private sector perspective, when you think about one country, this is one investment profile. I was a banker for 2 years, so I know. But when you think about 8, 9, or 10 countries that have agreed on certain premises of the rules and policy arrangements. First of all, of course, the kind of packages that you describe are so scalable. So it's a great example of a toolkit that could be transmitted around many countries to accelerate. But for you, Francois, from the perspective of the private sector, what are the key requirements? What are the key opportunities to make that such a financing model work?
First of all, I do believe that it's very important that the country has a vision for its population. The worst things I've seen is rich company or rich government put money, take a picture. It's a very colonialist, by the way of doing that, because they want to impose their way of using digital. So I like very much what Paula says. In fact, it's like the Maslow pyramid. You have the infrastructure, then you have the device, then you have the usage, the contents, and then you have HGPD and things like that. And it's true that when you go to some remote rural, this is not an iPhone. No, Steve Jobs say it's an iPhone. This is not an iPhone. This is connection to life. In fact, you have lots of mutualized services. Of course, you can call your friends. You can look at your bank account, should you have one. But you can also trade. You have a bicycle, you trade with something else, whatever. You can also have access to medicals and whatever, but you don't need 5G, That's why the Maslow pyramid starts by the usage. And I think it's very important, my experience of building, I've always first have a chat with the local authorities, the ministers or the president in some countries to say, what do you want to do for your population? Because if you have the Silicon Valley guys coming or the bankers or whatever, they just want to make money. That's it. And that's fine. I respect that. I think the success with private sector is to help to deliver a vision set by the government for their people. Because as a French person, we have been a colonialist, as you know, and I remember I did, when I was in 1984, I did a long trip with 6,000 kilometers. I started by Ivory Coast and we went everywhere. And I remember one night we went in a small village and there was a vestige of a church and a school, and there was a king, a guy on his crown, and a very wise person. And we talk about colonialism. We say, why this church is left and this and that. They say, you guys are stupid. You wanted to impose your lifestyle to us, but we're very happy doing what we do. Our kids are healthy. We have our traditions. And I think they should have done the other way, is how do you want to live and how we can help you. So for me, it's very important. That's why I'm very impressed by your president, Paula, when I met him about his vision, long-term vision, not election vision, but long-term vision. So after, you need to be very also pragmatic. Some company are here to make money, and that's fine, but you need to regulate the money, how it's spent, and how it's a partnership.
And Francois, if I may follow up though, because your amazing years at BT, and I gave a very modest introduction to Francois, but you mentioned the importance of the country knowing its vision. But what is the difference? How does the game change from a private sector perspective when it is 10 countries coming with a more unified vision? How does it improve the economics of the opportunity? Because, of course, the DCO is premised on this idea.
I think you pronounce the right word, is win-win. You need to have everything start by the local vision for the people. But after, you need to elevate the debate and show that if you unify your strengths, you can build a wide area networks. You can also mutualize the cost of satellite. Elon Musk is sending in the sky lots of cheap satellite, and the access to broadband, you just need a small router, an antenna. You can have access to everywhere in the world in the middle of nowhere. So I think the evolution of the infrastructure, again, needs to be driven by a consensus, a win-win deals, where everybody respects the role of everybody.
Please, Paula.
If I put myself in the shoes of the private sector, what's the benefit of a larger market than a single country, and which is what DCO is giving us. And this is what I think, and Francois, please correct me if I'm wrong. One, and maybe some companies are established, others are startups. Do you imagine if you have to go to 10 markets with different sets of regulations, and in every market it takes you maybe a year, 6 months, 8 months, 2 years to comply to the different regulations? So I think what DCO presents and similar organizations is the ability to even harmonize at a regulatory level, because the private sector, this is one of their biggest bottleneck. They'll come to Rwanda, they'll go to Bahrain, there are very varying requirements, approval processes. And so once we have a streamlined way of, if we look at things the same way and we're saying we're going to open up a market of, let's say, 500 million, but to do so, we need to have streamlined and aligned regulations, then that makes it easy for scale. And that's very important even for startups, because they don't have that luxury of 1 year trying to figure out how do I meet this regulation. They will die in the process.
Thank you so much for saying that exactly, because the large, big players, the traditional players, of which now you're an innovator, but you know how the big ones think, they can almost afford maybe the transaction costs of having a different regulatory arrangement with many markets. But for startups, it's a killer, these transaction costs. So the DCO tries to solve their problem this way. Interestingly, though, for venture capital, I think, they see then the startup community, when they have access to that larger market, for them, I think it's particularly attractive. What else, from the cross-border perspective, what are the obstacles in general to cross-border data flows that are most problematic, that most limit what countries can do in your view? What are some of the challenges to the cross-border digital economy where there are still barriers that need to be overcome?
I think even picking on the previous point I shared, it's that, one, there's the absence in certain countries of regulations around even things like personal data processing and collection. So the absence of that also means that there are huge gaps that you can't navigate, and automatically it will be a showstopper to even try to activate conversations around how do we even think about cross-border data flows. And so the other bit is, I remember about a year ago as we were working on our data protection and privacy law, one thing that everyone grapples with as we try to build that piece of legislation is the requirement for most of us as governments to require that private sector, anyone that is processing or collecting data, does it in country. So you imagine for a multinational, if in every country you have to invest in this kind of infrastructure, the cost of doing business goes up. And so what we tried to do with ours, because we knew, one, it's a sticky point, two, we have a small market, but if we want to be a proof of concept hub, we need to think differently about this, this particular requirement. And believe me, we had that requirement. We knew what it meant, because banks would come to us and say, we just don't know how this is even possible. We can't create a data center in every country. Like, the cost of doing business is just so high that in turn they cannot even help you with your objectives of affordability of financial services. So in essence, what we did was to come up with a concept around whitelisting. So we will look at countries that have at least regulations that are at par with what we're looking for. So if a company like his would want to do business in Rwanda, but they are hosting in another country, we just need to look into their regulations around data protection and privacy. And if they're at par with with the way we would want personal data to be treated and protected in terms of collection, processing, and everything, then we're happy to give a waiver to do so. And so I think, again, when it comes to the cross-border data flows, it's really, it still comes down to the policies and regulations around data and how that can be done. And I think we still have some work to do around that in terms of alignment and harmonization.
So clear. By the way, I won't misbehave, but we happen to have a visionary on this topic in the audience, but I will not expose her to too much attention. Francois, we're going to finish this now. We have the final round of discussions. and I'd like to just, if I may, go to what drives and puts my heart on fire on these topics. It is empirically demonstrated that conflict and violence is most common in the most disconnected parts of the world. There's a clear empirical correlation between being connected and peace. So as you look at this work, through your experience of your career, and this will be our last thing, just quickly, and we're going to finish in just 1 minute, how do you see this opportunity?
We call this a deny of reality. On my board, I have Jacques Attali, a famous economist, and he has developed a lot of ideas on that. And it's true that when you have a closed country with no access to knowledge or filtered knowledge, you create something which is, in my view, wrong. I strongly believe that a good digital platform is a platform for peace. We grew up, some of us have some white hair, some of them no, but we grew up in a world where you had to go from one country to another with passports and whatever. The young people right now, they're all brothers and sisters around the world. They listen to the same music, thanks to digital. They have the same value. They care about their life, about the planet, and whatever. So I'm a big promoter that the more digital infrastructure you have, the more usage, of course, the more application, the better the young people will drive us, the old guys like me, in the right direction, because the digital world has no boundaries and no passport.
Thank you so much. The last word goes to you, Your Excellency, please.
I think in the world we live in today, connectivity is a fundamental right. And so even when you look at areas that are in conflict, imagine the level of disconnect they have to information, to what's going around, a lot of misinformation happening. And so I think it's a fundamental right. It's something that we need to strive for as governments, as partners, to ensure that regardless of the circumstances that any jurisdiction may be going through, how do we prioritize this as a fundamental right, even in places of conflict?
Thank you so much. And we know that the challenges we face are transnational. They know no boundaries. So the human beings that can solve them need to be able to collaborate across boundaries too. For this, we're privileged to be in the context of the DCO, the World Economic Forum. Thank you for your attention. Please give a warm round of applause.